Hello. So it's Monday, March the 13th, 2023, and today I thought I would talk a bit about some of these major outer planet ingresses that we're going through. Of course, I've already spoken a bit about Saturn and Pisces, and this month we're also having the ingress of Pluto into Aquarius, which is a big deal. And before Now, I have to admit, I'm a somewhat young astrologer. I'm basically like the same age thereabouts as people like Chris Brennan and those guys. However, Chris Brennan has been doing astrology ever since he was in high school. And, back when I was a young person, a teenager growing up, um, I was more into things like synthesizers and making music, which is something that I continue to be enthusiastic about to this day. And things like astrology were only things that have opened up more recently in my life. And so the whole relationship I have to astrology, for one thing, is interesting because I've only have a small window of period of time of paying attention to the transits closely and being cognizant of where different planets are and stuff like this. Compared, if I look back at when I was in high school or when I was, younger, it's like I'm looking. I was not aware of all this astrology stuff going on back then, right? And so part of that's interesting for me because if we look at a Pluto ingress, right, the whole time that I've been practicing astrology and learning about astrology, Pluto has been in Capricorn, and that, even, if you go back to when Pluto first ingressed into Capricorn, that was way before I ever really started taking astrology seriously. It was back in 2008, right? And for me to understand, to talk about, if I was going to make a video about a Pluto ingress into Aquarius, I'm, as being a modest, I'm a modest student of astrology. I'm still learning, you could say, or at least in these, I'm not presenting these videos from the position of a person who has 1 million subscribers, as you can probably see on my links. I haven't established myself as an expert amongst the top ranks of the elite astrological community. Although I may be the same age, I am in spirit more of a young whippersnapper when it comes to this stuff, and I'm in a spirit of modesty, of not knowing, who am I to say what Pluto and Aquarius is all about? I barely even was paying attention to astrology for most of Pluto and Capricorn is kind of where I'm coming at it. So in that spirit, I would like to sort of understand Pluto and Capricorn, take a look back, a retrospective. Journey with me back to the days of, to look over this transit of in the sign of Capricorn. What does it mean, right? And there are certain things which I think characterize it, which, if we think about when Pluto actually ingressed into Capricorn, it happened in the year 2008, which of course is kind of synonymous in my mind with a number of different things, namely the stock market crisis. If you ever seen that movie, The Big Short, it's a good account of the story of what caused the stock market crisis to happen, and they do it in a way, it's almost like a comedy, so it's entertaining, so that it's not so boring trying to get through the nitty gritty details of why did the stock market collapse. But if you look at my phone here, that Pluto, hold on. In 2008, Pluto was at 29 Sagittarius. So it's kind of like where, and then in November 2008, it was in 0 Capricorn, right? And I'd have to I think it was around September or August when things really went to hell or whatever for the stock market. I have to pinpoint the exact dates of when things really happened, but you can see that's one thing to understand what Pluto and Capricorn means was that there's this big stock market crash, right? And a lot of it had to do with a housing bubble that was popped, right? Where people were granting subprime mortgages. They're basically giving out loans way too easy for people, and there was a bubble, and then it was based on false valuation of stocks and stuff like that. And so this is actually, I think it goes really well with what the meaning of Capricorn is, because Capricorn as an earth sign has all to do with your material resources, and not, you know, when it comes to wealth and power, we're all into, like, there's all this stuff about speculative financing and stuff like that, which can get you in trouble. Capricorn has something to do with the brass tacks of what you actually got to back you up. And I think that in that movie, The Big Short, it was kind of interesting to see the guys that were kind of behind the whole thing that happened, or at least calling out the stocks for being inflated stocks or whatever, that after the actual guys who saw this problem in the stock market and kind of pressed the button to exploit it and tip it over or whatever, these guys, when it became time to invest after all this mess had happened, if you look at what they went in to invest, it was basically stuff like water and like the very like basic resources. Like, what are the most, like, the opposite of this NFT stuff? I'm sorry if there's any crypto bros watching, but I think that my takeaway anyways of how to understand what Pluto and Capricorn has been all about the establishing the importance of real resources over speculative markets, and that there's certain you understand the trajectory of Pluto and Capricorn. You have it beginning with the stock market crash, and then you also have the election of Barack Obama at the same time, around abouts, and Barack Obama bailing out the stock market. And then basically, there's also another thing I was thinking, if you think about political, I'm not American, I'm Canadian, but because Canada is such a small population to America, they're our neighbors. We kind of get inundated with American politics, but it's a way to think about different political eras, regardless of what your country is, because you can also go like Reagan, Thatcher, and see it as whatever international kind of era, right? But I was born in the 80s during the Reagan era of Pluto and Scorpio, right? Pluto and Scorpio, Reagan into the original George Sr., Herbert Walker Bush, whatever his name is, the original Daddy Bush, and a bit of Bill Clinton, all get put into the Pluto in Scorpio years. And then Pluto in Sagittarius is a bit more neatly defined by two presidents rather than three, of being Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. That we're probably more, my generation is more familiar with. And there's like the era of, like Jon Stewart on The Daily Show making cracking comedic jokes following George W. Bush and the war in Iraq, then followed by Stephen Colbert. There's a certain era, right? So if you get a sense of what the certain era was like during a certain, like, I don't know about you guys, first of all, I'm going to keep my own personal life out of this and just talk about these kind of things, because as a collective, everybody can track these kinds of political collective changes and stuff like this. But there's definitely a characteristic of the Pluto in Sagittarius era that was different with the Pluto in Capricorn era, and that there was the shock of the financial crisis in 2008, and then the following events that happened after the 2008 crisis, including the Occupy movement, and then including the Arab Spring, I guess you could say, although that's different, that's in Egypt or whatever. Then they had in 2013, you had big revelations coming forward with Edward Snowden And I think that you could argue the Snowden stuff would be relative to Pluto, because I think there's something about Pluto which is all about secrecy, which is all about power, which is all about control, which is all about privacy, and this kind of thing that Pluto, the espionage kind of aspect of Pluto could come in, right? And then as we go, there are also certain things that happen that I remember as there's something about Pluto that relates to fear and panic and stuff like this. And it was a long time before we had to deal with pandemics. But I remember in what was around 2015 or something, there was a lot of the scare of around ISIS and terrorist groups, especially when they had that terrorist attack in France. And as you put all this together, I think all of these are the tensions that we were navigating while Pluto was in Capricorn that in some way were related. And then eventually it came into the stuff, of course, with Donald Trump era politics and all that. And then before you know it, now we're into the COVID era. All the way from 2008 financial crisis to COVID-19 pandemic and the resulting problems out of that. All of this has been this big messy era has all been Pluto in Capricorn. And not to say that things were all just well and good before this happened, but back in the Pluto and Sagittarius era, it was more focused on, let's say, the war in Iraq with George W. Bush, the war on terror, the fallout after September 11th, or also the leading into September 11th was also Pluto in Sagittarius, because it was the late 90s, Y2K into whatever. And then, so we can kind of see the Pluto as defining these kind of clear generational eras. And one of the things that I would recommend for somebody trying to understand the relevance of these planetary cycles in your own natal chart, I have been reading Liz Greene's book on Neptune, and I'll just say that it makes me glad that I finished reading the Anti-Oedipus before getting back to that book, because it may seem like the whole Anti-Oedipus Deleuze and Guattari thing isn't relevant until you have to read some of the psychoanalytic kind of Jungian influence stuff, where it is actually very much kind of skewed with this kind of Freudian perspective, which is not completely false. I'll be getting that, but I do find there's some of these Neptune dynamics of there's certain you can get rid of the funny Freudian things and just talk about maybe things like autonomy and boundaries, or things to do with shame or stuff like this, and maybe make it more neutral than some of these kind of Freudian influence psychoanalysis directions they take it, right? But we've already had whatever. I'm kind of getting off track here, but anyways, there's Neptune things, right? And the role that Neptune has in a chart, and the role that Uranus has in a chart, and that in the 90s, there was a Uranus-Neptune conjunction in Capricorn, right? Now, depending on when you were born specifically, this conjunction is going to fall in different places. You may even have Saturn there with it. You may have, when was Jupiter hit? I don't even know. But the Jupiter might even get in the action at some point. There's, depending on how your chart works, though, what I've noticed looking at my own chart, my own transits, is that I had Neptune in Capricorn, and since this is all about the Pluto and Capricorn years, what I thought was interesting was to notice when the transiting Pluto hit my natal Neptune placements, that these seem to be pretty important events, although because these outer planets are generational, as in everybody born the same year as me is going to be having the same Neptune placement, getting more or less, right? I mean, but they're such slow moving planets. That's not as it's more of a collective significance, that there's going to be a whole waves of people more or less the same age who are going to be having a natal Neptune placement hit by a natal Pluto placement or whatever, right? And that if you are younger, though, because I'm used to thinking about people my generation or roundabouts who have these planets. Like if you're a 90s kid, you're going to have Uranus and Neptune and Capricorn, and you have gone through this Pluto hitting those planets. And I'm just saying it's interesting to look at the timing specifically of when Pluto hit those placements. If you were a 90s kid, if you're younger than that, if there's people that are more like Zoomers, it'll be interesting because they will probably have some of these placements like Uranus or Neptune in Aquarius, and now they're going to get the same thing of Pluto hitting off these planets in Aquarius, right? And I mean, it's not to be taken lightly. But it'd be interesting, anyways. If I don't know, you don't. Rather than going over the specific details of what this is, there are, at least it's a timing technique that seems relevant to me to look at, to understand whatever different events in your own life, anyways. Okay, so I just recorded a bunch on talking about Pluto and Capricorn, and one of the qualities of having a conversation like this is that it involves looking back, right? And maybe this is appropriate for Pisces season, as Pisces has the two fishes, and Pisces is considered to come at the end of the zodiac and sort of be, in a way, retrospectively looking back on the rest of the process of the zodiac, as well as looking forward to beginning a new cycle. And we're in this kind of looking forward to spring to start, and maybe having a bit of a whimsical nostalgia and looking back at the same time and stuff. And the thing is, one of the issues that has been on my mind over the last number of years has been the problem with nostalgia and getting stuck reflectively looking back on things. However, I made a couple of videos recently talking about Marshall McLuhan, because he's a Sun-Neptune conjunction, and we're going through a Sun-Neptune conjunction right now, more or less, pretty soon. Perfects in a few days, anyways. And one of the things about McLuhan, when I watched his movie, The Medium, The Massage, that I noticed was that McLuhan had this line about looking back, saying that it is actually normal, it seems, to live life looking in the rear view, or at least if you look at where he was talking from, was he lived through World War II and was, an intellectual in the post-war period. And from that perspective, though, when you can see the hippie movement, right, of the 60s, that a lot of the fashion, not that I was alive back then, right? But if you look at stuff like the Grateful Dead or like Easy Rider, or I don't know what other examples to give, maybe even like Captain Beefheart even, right? But there seemed to be some kind of this like looking back to a kind of a pioneer Wild West kind of culture, or trying to get in touch with the roots of America or something like this, right? And that, to some extent, there may be, I just find it interesting, though, because there's whatever people associate with what you would call a hippie nowadays, and but it's obviously a bit different than what it must have been like in the 60s. But because, for one thing, in the 60s, a certain cultural moment in time where the looking back, because now we consider 60s to be retro and vintage and stuff like that, but there was almost, it was if in the 60s they had their own retro and vintage thing, and that's why it was like, these Grateful Dead kind of guys were all into wearing like the Davy Crockett hats or whatever it would be, right? Like going back to the hunter trapper wilderness. I mean, you could say that it's all about like, taking it back to Mother Earth and getting back to being, but there's a historical thing in it, though, isn't there? Right? Is what I'm trying to suggest. And I'm sorry, it kind of made me look at something that I hadn't considered before, which I was a bit frustrated. For example, like, I'm into synthesizers and all the synthesizers that come out, or there's this kind of problem of people getting stuck just doing remakes of old stuff, right? Like Roland making a million different versions of the 808 or the 909 drum machine and not really having any new ideas aside from just doing another new groove box or what. But anyways, I won't spend too much time about like synthesizers here, but there's often a, you get stuck in a loop of fetishizing the past and recycling and regurgitating old ideas and not really moving forward, right? And that the 60s, we know the psychedelic revolution and all of that are portrayed to us as us young people, us young millennials who weren't around for it. We had boomers, our parents went through this, but it was portrayed to us from the boomer generation as a time of great, breakthrough of like freedom, of, breaking out of these old patterns and doing new revolutionary things. But then if you actually look at the culture, a lot of it is like, let's play like blues music, which is basically just copying things from black people, right? Or else like let's go back and like bring these sort of like is the kind of there is this old nostalgic looking back quality to the 60s, whatever they were doing, or like trying to bring out these archaic things which had been forgotten or whatever, like folk music, right? It's like folk music, bringing back folk music in the 60s isn't really like a breakthrough into some revolutionary new thing. It's actually, if anything, trying to appeal to a kind of traditionalism, right? Or that maybe there's something that comes out of it, which is a kind of a new tradition where you're kind of like making it up, like you're kind of making up your own folk songs, which aren't really, that you're trying to like, this sounds like it should be traditional, but I'm just kind of jamming around and doing my own thing. That could be like a different way to look at it, maybe, right? But I always just thought I don't know. Okay, what does this have to do with Pluto, though, right? Is that Pluto, during the 60s, there's this Pluto-Uranus conjunction, and in Cosmos and Psyche, Rick Tarnas talks about the Uranus-Neptune conjunction of the 90s as being, it's a little bit the same, but a little bit different, and there's a certain, that you had the second summer of love, as they called it, with the rave culture. They actually called it the second summer of love, right? And that the sort of repeating archetype in the hippie culture, and then a reemergence of a 90s raver hippie culture that's sort of similar but sort of different in that. And now I would feel like this whole thing, there's this taken over a kind of a nihilistic attitude that, well, maybe I'll just go there. There's a certain, especially I find, this is the tension between the whole problem with, it's either become you're a Jordan Peterson supporter or you're a nihilistic Marxist leftist or something like this, as a kind of a cliche dichotomy maybe, right? But there's a certain attitude where everything is inherently meaningless because we have to create our own meaning. We have to do it. That the meaning isn't pre-given, so you have to be an existentialist, and you have to create your own meaning in life, right? And if that is the case, people don't see their current era that we're in. It'll be find in a Marxist view as late capitalism, but other than just capitalism becoming more and more ridiculous as time goes on, there's no sort of underlying principle which to understand where we are in the grand scheme of things. And that the thing about astrology, this is the whole issue, though, is that astrology essentially puts it into a symbolic order where you can see that things like the fall of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall are correlated to an astrological junction of Uranus and Neptune, and that if you take these two planets, they're in a cycle that midway point is an opposition, right? So it's and we're not even at the square yet, right? We're not even at the first quarter. We're only at the first sextile, right, of a Uranus-Neptune cycle. So what a Uranus-Neptune cycle suggests is that whatever happened in the 90s, which you could also look in terms of people all being all fussed about technology and stuff like this, or the internet, that we were only in the opening sextile. This is what I was trying to talk about in my last video about Uranus-Neptune, that we're only on the opening sextile of this Uranus-Neptune stuff, and that in about, not even 10 years, but maybe more like 20 years, right? If you really want to get into it, it's going to be more like 20 years until we're into the square between Uranus and Neptune. And that's, so we have this, and then we're going to really be seeing the problems with internet technology 20 years from now. Never mind whatever we're seeing now, right? Like, or whatever the fallout of the end of the Soviet Union is, or whatever whatever these issues we're having. And, you know, Pluto, looking back at, I have to admit my own frailty and my own whatever. Like, I have, a Pluto cycle. It's like kind of funny. Like like how many pets do you have that would survive longer than a Pluto cycle? How many relationships do you have that would survive longer than a Pluto cycle? How many, there's something about Pluto that is kind of like the god of death, and it's kind of heavy business because it's a big chunk of time. There might be a lot of stuff which doesn't last through Pluto and Aquarius. By the time we get through to Pluto and Pisces, we might be in a completely different situation than what it looks like today. And then that's what I talk about Pluto being all about transformation and all this kind of stuff, right? But I don't know what I'm like. I just wanted to put in this bit because I thought my video was a bit short, anyways. There's something about the nostalgia of looking back to the 90s, or like I've been listening to that Charlie XCX song, like the 1999, because it feels like so much like being stuck in a loop in a way, right? Where like all of these movies that we watch are all reboots or whatever, or that there's like this kind of thing. Sometimes there's this sense of being kind of culturally stuck, like. Mark Fisher talked about this a lot. He was talking about how as the Netflix and all this stuff starts to roll out, that in some way they're just giving you the media of the 90s, the media of the 20th century, streaming through 21st century technology, but what are we actually getting that's new culture, right? And there's certain issues about what the finance of media and stuff like that, and what gets money to get produced and gets paid, and whatever. I'm not going to get into all that, complaining about the big business and all this kind of stuff, but I do think it's an issue with Pluto, what Pluto stands for, the power behind things, and I don't know, this is a bit rambly, but I hopefully you guys can see there's some sort of like point in this, right? That there's a kind of the nihilism of our times where all the stuff going on doesn't seem like it falls into some sort of greater order or greater pattern, and that astrology at least promises in a way that you can understand things in terms of a cycle. And I think despite all this stuff about being into critical theory or philosophy, I still, at the end of the day, I'm choosing astrology because to me it makes more sense to fold all this other stuff into the astrology than try to debunk the astrology with it the other way around, right? And I mean, even like the example I see is there's stuff happening recently with people like Slavoj Zizek, and him getting into this big mess, with getting into controversial attacks on wokeism and stuff like this. But what's funny is that if you look at Slavoj Zizek's chart, he's got Venus and Mars and Pisces, Mars in the very late degrees of Pisces, and now look, Mars is getting hit by Neptune, and this this whole transit we're going through right now, that the Mars and Gemini squaring these Pisces transits. Like Slavoj Zizek is getting his chart kicked by this astrology transit, and he's kind of unconsciously maybe saying some stupid stuff that goes with this whole this transit. I wonder if I should maybe I could edit these together and put some graphics up so you can kind of see what I'm saying, right? I don't know. I'm kind of self-conscious that maybe this isn't a very good video, but this is my idea for today anyways, to talk about retrospectively talk about what Pluto and Capricorn has been in like, and the kind of also the to address this kind of issue of the habit of looking back, the habit of needing to, like, this is the whole thing. We don't really, to understand what the future is going to be like, we also kind of have to look at what the past is like. And there's some way in the astrology, I kind of have this feeling like if you can understand Pluto, these transits of Pluto and Capricorn better, then you're going to understand Pluto and Aquarius better. It only makes sense to me, right? Like maybe first we need to sort out Pluto and Capricorn before we move on to Pluto and Aquarius. That was my idea for this video anyways. Hopefully this wasn't a waste of time. What can I say?